There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. I'm here with a very special guest, literary translator, Tina Kover. She is the translator of books that I have read, including most recently, The Beauty of the Death Cap by Catherine Dostoevsky-Coase. And I am just absolutely delighted to have her on my channel to talk about all things bookish. Hello, Tina.
Hello, Shawn.
How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks.
Great.
How are you?
Great. And you're in London.
Well, I'm in Durham, actually, which
In
is
Durham.
sort of up near the Scottish border, near Newcastle.
Oh, nice. It's about 11 a.m. there.
That's right.
And what's the weather like?
It's rainy today.
Same here. We have that in common. So I have read one book that you've translated, that book by Dostoevsky-Coase, which was quite a wild ride, The Beauty of the Death Cap. Can you do an elevator pitch for that book? It was wonderful and zany. I loved it.
So it's a short novella, about 37,000 words, so it's a quick read. It's a debut novel by Catherine, who's actually a good friend of mine, as well as being professor of French here at Durham University.
Oh, okay.
That's how we came to know each other. And the book won several prizes in France, so I was really honored to translate it, and it was a really fun project for me because, as you know, the narrator has a very distinctive voice and a distinctive personality. The book has a lot of Black humor, and you kind of never know where the next twist is going to lead. It's a sort of a memoir style written by an elderly man living in the south of France who has had a very colorful life, touched with a lot of tragedy. And so the question becomes, how has this tragedy come about?
Yes.
And the answer is not straightforward.
Right.
So,
and do you consider yourself now one of the leading experts on all things mycological? As a result
I
of
learned one thing I love about translating is that I learn so much with every book I do. And in this particular case, yes, I learned a lot about mushrooms.
Yes, he is obsessed with mushrooms, to put it mildly.
Yes.
It's an obsession that runs in the family and is integral to the story.
Yes, absolutely.
I kept looking them up and looking at the pictures, and that was really fun. I didn't ever really have any interest in mushrooms beyond enjoying eating them. But yeah, it was really, really interesting. And then this one I haven't read yet, Nagar Javadi's Disoriental. This is the one of the ones I know about that has maybe gotten the most renown. So what's your elevator pitch for this one? This
one has been and continues to be just an absolute joy to be associated with. It is also a debut novel. It is semi-autobiographical, although heavily fictionalized. And certainly, I think part of the interest in reading it, once you know that it's semi-autobiographical, is wondering what did and didn't actually happen in Nagar Javadi's life. But it's the story of a young woman who is the daughter of two very politically outspoken and brilliant parents. And she spends the first part of her life, her childhood, in Tehran. And then her family flees when the revolution takes place, and they end up in Paris. So part of the book is the story of her childhood as well as her family history. She goes back a few generations. And then you're also reading the story of her life in Paris now as she undergoes fertility treatment, or at least the book opens in a fertility clinic. So it's her personal story, and she's an extremely unique individual, but it's also the story of her family and the story of Iran, and it is just a beautiful, beautiful book.
I have heard nothing but good things about it. Looking forward to getting to it. Here's one by a man.
Yes.
Older brother, now help me if I mispronounce, Mahir Guven.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay,
well done.
Older brother by Mahir Guven. So how about this one?
This book, and when you read it, you'll understand was an enormous challenge for me to translate
Mm.
because it is narrated by two brothers. Obviously, the voice you hear most often is that of the older brother, but you also hear the voice of the younger brother as well. These are two young men who have grown up in a very rough banlieue just outside the Paris city center. They've gone down very different roads in life. One of them is a bit of a burnout. He joined the army. He is no longer in the army. He struggles with a lot of demons. The younger brother is a nurse. He's actually gone down the route of medicine, and he feels pulled to do more to help people, the people that really need help in his view. So he ends up traveling to Syria,
Mm-hmm.
which is where their father is from. The mother is French, the father is Syrian. The younger brother travels to Syria to work as a medical officer for an NGO and then disappears. I don't want to spoil it because it really is. There's so much about it that's unexpected.
You've
But it's
sold
a
me.
very, yeah, it's another very distinctive voice. The language is very sort of urban. There's a lot of slang and a lot of vernacular. And it's not just French, it's sort of Franco-Arabic kind of
Sure, I was
slang.
thinking,
So
yeah.
it was really challenging, but I love doing it. And it's also a book that I really highly recommend.
Thank you. So you have recently started, you're a YouTuber now. Tell us about your new YouTube channel, Tina.
Yes, I have started a YouTube channel along with friend and colleague, Charlotte Coombe,
Uh-huh.
who is the translator of Holiday Heart and The President's Room. She's a translator mostly from the Spanish. And the two of us have launched this YouTube channel called Translators Aloud. And I hope if anybody hasn't checked it out, that they do. And
Definitely
watch
putting in a link in the show notes. Yep.
Great, great. What it is we post videos of short readings by translators from their own work. So not only is it a great way to get a little taste of a book that you might not have heard of or might not read otherwise, but it's a way for translators to have the spotlight all to themselves and read beautifully. Actually, we've had some really beautiful readings submitted. People are really talented. It's not just the translations that are beautiful, it's the readings themselves. I think we're right up to about 40 readings posted now from around a dozen languages, and a lot of really, really wonderful books and exciting stuff to come as well. We're going to be hopefully posting quite a bit for Women in Translation Month.
Just gonna say, yeah.
And then Children's Literature Month or Kidlit Month is in September, so we'll have some fun stuff coming then too.
That is awesome. I am a little bit starstruck, Tina, because I've never talked to a translator before. And we're mostly going to focus on talking about you as a reader. But before we move into that, which I'm really looking forward to, I do have one kind of stupid question about as a reader of translated fiction. And let me, if you'll allow me to give a little anecdote, I worked as a proofreader for a translator here in Japan, not literary, it was resume translation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have enough Japanese language skills to do anything with the translation, but I was hired to proofread the English.
Sure.
And oh my God, the things that were in those resumes. And when I was proofreading and editing, I would just take it out or I would put it into language that made sense. And I feuded with my boss for that job because she said, that's how it was written in Japanese. That's what we have to put it in. It's like, but it sounds stupid. Nobody's going to hire you if you have this kind of phraseology in your resume. It just was so clunky or completely inappropriate for some reason. And
Sure.
we could, I could never come to an agreement about it. So finally, I just kind of gave up and just did a much more minimal edit.
Mm-hmm.
But as a reader of literary fiction in translation, occasionally, not often, but occasionally I come across what I consider to be bad writing. And I never know, and I have often posed this in my booktube reviews or when I'm talking about the books, like I don't know whether it's the translation or the original, but the writing wasn't very good. So that's, if you can pull a question out of that, it would be when a translator is translating bad writing? Are you ethically bound to translate it into bad English, or how does that work?
Well, obviously, I don't think it's controversial to say that some writing is better than others. Some translation is better than other translation as well. Some translators are better than others. So the first thing I would say is that as a translator, you always do your best with whatever source material you're working with. Sometimes you can improve on an original piece of writing that maybe wasn't the greatest, but there's only so much you can do, obviously, because our job is not to completely rewrite somebody's work. Our job is to stay true to the original text. So I wouldn't say it would be a case of deliberately turning bad language into bad language, but you also have a duty to convey the source in as pure a way as possible. And I don't mean linguistically pure, I mean pure in that you're conveying the sense as accurately as possible. So sometimes you can only do so much. But that said, obviously, none of us are perfect, and there will be a situation where a translator will make a choice that maybe isn't the best choice for whatever reason. I know I've certainly gone back and looked at my own stuff from time to time and just been horrified. Like, why did I choose that phrasing? Reading my own stuff for me is actually kind of like watching yourself on TV or listening to your own voice. It's just, yeah, it's excruciating though. It's terrible. I really don't like to read my own work because you always see something you could have done differently. Always. A good translation of good writing is a thing of absolute beauty. A bad translation of good writing is just awful. And then there are bad translations of bad writing. We really depend on our editors a lot. That's very important. When you're a translator, you live with the text for so long that occasionally, by the time you come to the end, by the time you come to proofreading for the umpteenth time, you've been looking at it for so long that you can't really see it clearly. So that's where the editors come in. I have been so fortunate with my editors and proofreaders, and they will very often catch things that I didn't catch, or, just smooth something out, just the tiny bit that makes all the difference. Hopefully that answers your question.
That is fascinating. And I'm also thinking about the fact that when I'm reading the book, I'm doing my own translation through what I've, how my day's going that day and what books I've read before and what my own autobiographical connection to or lack thereof. And that is another translation. And then you enter into the milieu of audiobooks where the audio narrator is doing another translation. So there's so many levels to this thing.
Absolutely. There's a translator called Karen Emmerich who translates from the Greek, who has done a fair bit of work on the hypothesis, let's say, that there really is no such thing as a final text. The texts are constantly in the process of sort of mutation.
I love that.
I think it's a really important statement, yeah.
Because then there is the process of my relationship with the book I read last week, last year, last decade, also in flux and changing, and that's another layer of translation.
I think every reading experience is singular. Even if you read a book 30 times, it's a different experience every time.
I just want to see why that name is familiar. You said, oh no, I'm thinking of is he a translator? Michael Emmerich.
That's her brother, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Michael Emmerich, who translates from, I think, the Japanese.
Yeah, this was about the Japanese. This was something that came up in my talk with Ronan.
Right.
Yeah. So now I'm going to ask you a question that I usually like to start these Zoom chats with, and take it where you will. What kind of reader are you, Tina?
I am a voracious reader, and I always have been, which I think has been the key to making me a good translator as well. I don't think you can be a good writer unless you are a good reader, really. I read a lot. Most of what I read is nonfiction.
Oh, interesting.
I just prefer it. So I read a lot of history. I read a lot of sociology. I read a lot of true crime. But I also really enjoy historical fiction. I'm a huge fan of Golden Age mystery writers, although my favorite, absolute favorite writer of all time is Raymond Chandler.
Okay. What do they call them? Hard-boiled detective stories?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that your choice in reading is affected by the fact that you are a translator of literary fiction and that you're choosing to read other stuff? Or is that independent of each other?
Well, I think that probably does play into it a little bit. You know, most of my translation work is in fiction. And I tend to be also a really picky reader when it comes to contemporary fiction.
Mm.
There's a lot of really amazing stuff out there, but there's also a lot of bad writing that gets published.
I think you've seen
And
a few of my videos, so you know that I agree with you.
yeah, it makes me crazy, honestly. It makes me crazy, some of the stuff that gets published and some of the stuff that sells well. This sort of mediocre cookie cutter fiction. It really bothers me that a lot of that is what flies off the shelves. So I tend to be really, really particular about what fiction I read. And I will admit that I don't read enormous amounts of translated fiction.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is not because I don't like it. It's because as a translator, I find myself so aware of the fact that it's a translation that I find myself focusing more on word choice and structure and wondering what the original was, the original word or the original sentence, and why the translator made that choice. I get so distracted by that stuff that I can't really pay attention to the plot.
And I imagine that another part of that might be that it also feels like you're still working, like you're not relaxing. You're still working as a translator when you're reading.
Yeah, it can feel that way, definitely.
Interesting.
I mean, I do read some translated fiction and love it, but that is a problem I run up against occasionally.
Very interesting. So I am almost exclusively a reader of literary fiction, so I don't want to just steer the conversation into that area because that's my interest. So why don't you just tell us, what are you reading these days, or what have you read recently that's been good or bad or indifferent?
Okay, let's see. I've got my little, I wanted to make sure that I remembered some, so I've got my little notes here. I just finished a really brilliant biography of Ava Braun.
Oh.
Which I know sounds funny, but it is just brilliantly written. It's so interesting, just a total sort of re-examination of her role in the Nazi hierarchy. And that actually was in translation. The original author is Heike Gortemacher, and I'm afraid I'm not sure who the translator is, but if you can maybe include it down below. I think it was published last year, maybe the year before. It hasn't been out very long, but it's really, really, really well done.
Wow.
I'll put in yet another plug for Leonard and Hungry Paul by our friend Ronan, because it is just such a beautiful book and has been nominated for so many awards, and deservedly so.
It's done extremely well.
Absolutely.
So you've just read it recently?
Pretty recently, yeah. A couple of months ago.
I don't know how I got wind of it. I think inevitably I find out about stuff on Twitter, and then so I found out about it like the day before it was released last year, and it was like $2 on Kindle or something, and I read it.
Oh, you were one of the early readers. That's great. I do find Twitter such a great source for book recommendations.
The opening paragraph of that novel was absolutely fantastic. Do you remember it? Where I forget if it was Leonard, or I think it was Leonard's. It's a story of his birth. How did it go?
I'm going to look back at it.
His father died in childbirth.
Yes.
It was just so adorable and wonderful. I do a wrap up at the end of each year with various and sundry categories, and the best opening I gave to that novel last year, because that opening.
It is. And I also love the fact that he refers to life as a daisy chain of small events.
That's right.
I think that's just a beautiful way of describing it. It's a beautiful book, really it is.
I'm really excited to see what the next one's going to be all about. Already got
so am I.
Date. Yeah.
It's always interesting to see what a writer will come up with as a second book after the initial debut has been so successful.
That's right. And so much pressure, I imagine.
It must be. Yeah. Oh, I'll tell you something else that I read just recently that's really, really great. It's by Hallie Rubenhold, and it's called The Five, which again, we're sort of keeping in on the theme of historical nonfiction. This is a look at the lives, the actual lives, not the deaths, of the 5 women murdered by Jack the Ripper.
Oh, yeah, that has been kind of a booktube darling. I've heard a lot about that one. Yes.
It's gotten a lot of attention and well-deserved. It's
really
a really thoughtful and very even-handed look at how these women lived, how they got to the point where they were living in such desperate poverty in the East End. And again, I think it's really important, to see these women as human beings rather than just statistics.
So what kind of history are you interested in? So you've mentioned, like, we're talking World War II or Nazi Germany. What is that, a particular interest, or?
It is actually. 20th century history has
20th century?
Recently, within the last few years, become a major interest for me. I mean, I've always been interested. I used to read a lot on the 19th century. Eventually, I just sort of moved forward a bit into the 20th, but it was just such a momentous century, the 20th century. I find it endlessly fascinating, particularly with the current political and social situation. I have found sort of a dark fascination in looking back at the interwar period and the rise of fascism, and found so many answers to questions that are being asked now. How has this happened? Well, it's happening now the same way it happened back then. I wish more people, I guess, would take another look at where we were.
Yeah, the cliche quote, who did it come from? Is it Henry Ford? Somebody said history repeats itself, but then somebody much smarter than that said, no, it doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
but it's true.
Yeah.
I just never would have expected in my lifetime that would be the part of history repeating itself. But then again, who would have ever expected us to be where we are now?
It's a dark,
so
dark time.
Ways. It's a dark time.
At a pandemic and stir. Jeebus.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so thank God for literature right now. Thank God for books, because one thing that is good that maybe has come out of the pandemic is that people are having hopefully more time to read and more of an inclination to read.
Was that true for you?
I've always made time to read no matter what. As I said, I'm pretty insatiable, but I've definitely found literature such a comfort during this time. Literature, well, when I say literature, I mean both fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, definitely me too. But at those first few weeks where it was just such an unstable, scary time, I just virtually stopped reading because I was so upset and I couldn't stop reading, following the news. And I still have never stopped following the news, but just it did make me less of a reader than I was. But I came back after about a month.
Sure. Well, I think obviously when this all first began, it may be just hard to concentrate on much.
That's right.
Because we were all under such, not just stress, but just shock. I think we were all in a state of shock that everything had happened so quickly. Now, when things have become whatever this current normal is, maybe get back to the reading.
Hey, lovely people. Well, this is but half of Tina's and my fascinating conversation, so stay tuned for part 2 coming maybe next week. Thanks for watching.